Here's how to make my version of sourdough hot cross buns. These are made without any commercial yeast, it's just sourdough starter. Here are all the ingredients you'll need for this recipe. 400 grams of bread flour, 165 grams of whole milk, 1 egg or about 50 grams, 10 grams of salt, 60 grams of white sugar, then 2 tablespoons of mixed spice. If you don't have access to mixed spice, like I don't have access to it here, so I just used 1 tablespoon of cinnamon and then 1 tablespoon of pumpkin pie spice. So you can look up your own recipe for British mixed spice if you want to. Then later we're gonna be incorporating 57 grams of butter, that's half a US stick, and then 75 grams of raisins and 75 grams of golden raisins. I've got those soaking in liquid right now while the starter is rising. Once your starter has doubled in size, it should look nice and bubbly and it's ready to use. Now it's time to add pretty much all of the ingredients except the flour. Go ahead and add your milk, the egg, 200 grams of sourdough starter, the salt, the sugar, and all of the spice mix. Then go ahead and stir that together with your mixer or with a spoon if you're doing this by hand. You can totally do this by hand. And by the way, the spice mixture doesn't really go well with the wet ingredients, so you could just save that and add it with the flour later. That's what I should have done. Once those ingredients are pretty much well incorporated together, go ahead and add all of the flour to your mixing bowl. Lower the dough hook of your mixer, or just using a wooden spoon or whatever you're using, and bring all of these ingredients together until it forms a shaggy dough. This dough is still fairly dry, it's not too high hydration, so it'll take a minute or two of mixing to incorporate the flour in with all the liquid ingredients. But after a minute or two at medium speed, you should get a dough that comes together just like this. It'll hold together and it'll feel just clumpy and sticky to the touch, but now is the perfect time to add our butter. So add all of your softened butter, that's 57 grams, it's just at room temperature. And then lower the dough hook of your mixer and go ahead and knead all of this together for about 8 to 10 minutes, starting at low speed and moving on to medium speed once the butter gets more incorporated. If you're kneading by hand, incorporating the butter will be a little bit more tricky than using a mixer, but I did my sourdough brioche recipe a while ago. I kneaded that by hand and that included a lot more butter than this, so you can totally knead this by hand if you want to. You can clean the sides of the bowl with a dough scraper, but honestly the dough eventually picks up everything from the sides of the bowl on its own. Once the dough holds together, it pulls away from the sides of the bowl, that's when you can stop the kneading process. The dough should feel a little bit sticky, just slightly tacky. That's when I like to move the dough into a glass container that I grease lightly with a little bit of oil. I just use the oil so that the dough doesn't stick as much to the sides of this glass container. I like to use glass because I can see through the glass and I'll be able to see how much the dough is rising during the bulk fermentation. Just give the dough a few stretch and folds in this bowl just to make it look nice and pretty. Then you're going to close the lid of the bowl and let this dough rest and relax for 30 minutes before you add the raisins. Then a half hour later, the dough will have relaxed a little bit, it'll be a little more stretchy, and it'll be easier to incorporate the raisins. Speaking of the raisins, they've been soaking for a while, so go ahead and just drain the water from the raisins however you can. Then mix the raisins together a little bit so the golden ones mix around with the regular ones. And now it's time to incorporate the first batch of raisins. Go ahead and flatten the dough out a little bit, and you're going to add 1/3 of the raisins right on top of the dough. We're going to be incorporating the raisins in 3 parts. So just starting with 1/3 of the raisins, press those down into the dough a little bit with your fingertips just so they stick to the dough. Then you're just going to be stretching and folding the dough to incorporate the raisins. So grab an edge of the dough, fold it over the top, then grab the next edge of the dough and fold it over the top. I like to work in just the 4 corners of the dough. So grab the next corner, fold it over, grab the next corner and fold it over the top as well. And with each fold, you're folding the raisins into the middle. And as you can see, the raisins are disappearing inside of the dough. So you've got the dough on the outside and the raisins on the inside. Grab your last corner of dough, and if you lose any raisins, you can just go ahead and put those into the crease. And once you've got all 4 corners of the dough folded over, the raisins should have completely disappeared inside of the dough, as you can see here. Go ahead and pop the lid back onto the bowl, and you're going to let this sit for another 30 minutes, and then you'll incorporate the next batch of raisins. This half-hour rest just lets the dough relax a little bit, and it actually makes the raisins a lot easier to incorporate than if you try to put them all in at the same time. So flatten out the dough and add another 1/3 of the raisins on top of the dough, and you're going to do the exact same stretching and folding that you did like the first time, except this time you're going to feel raisins already in the dough, so you're going to have to handle the dough a little bit more gently than you did the first time. Now, once all of these raisins are hidden inside the dough, go ahead and just rearrange the dough nicely in the bowl and then cover it up with the lid, and we'll let this rest for another 30 minutes before you add the last batch of raisins. Now 30 minutes later, this is going to be the hardest batch of raisins to incorporate because the dough is already full of 2 layers of raisins, so it's going to be really delicate. And when you do your stretching and folding, the first batch of raisins that you put in is going to try to break through the other end of the dough. So you might see the raisins already trying to pop out of the dough on the other side. It looks really bumpy. So just fold really gently this time. You're just trying to hide these raisins in the dough without ripping the other side of the dough. If you rip the other side of the dough, the raisins will start to spill out, and it's totally fine if that happens. You can recover from that, but it's a lot easier if you keep the dough intact and you don't rip any of the dough. So keep that in mind and just fold very gently until all of these raisins are hidden inside the dough once more. And you can see this dough is just full of 3 layers of raisins. It's looking nice and bumpy. And because we incorporated the raisins in 3 batches like this, the raisins should be evenly dispersed in layers throughout the dough. So just carefully cup and pull the dough against the counter like this to form a tight ball of dough. You're building some tension on the top of the ball, but you don't want to rip any of the dough. Then go ahead and put that into the bowl, cover it up with the lid, and then move this to a nice warm spot in your house to bulk ferment. I like to move it to the oven, which is turned off with that light on. That's going to give it a nice warm environment to proof. And because this is such an enriched dough with a lot of fruit inside of it, it's going to be hard to tell when this dough has truly doubled in size. So just use your best judgment. Give this about 6 to 8 hours at room temperature. When it's bulk fermented for a while and it's bouncy and light to the touch, that's when you can move on to the shaping step. Or if you're like me, you can cover up the dough and move it to the fridge overnight. If you want to make these rolls the next day instead of right away, you can do what I'm doing and just move them to the fridge. The next day, your dough is going to be a lot easier to handle when you take it out of the fridge. You won't have seen much rise in the fridge, but the dough is going to be really firm. That's mostly because of the butter in the dough that's solidified at cold temperatures, and it's making the dough really firm to the touch. The firmness of the dough is going to make it difficult to get out of the glass container, but the buns are going to be a lot easier to shape when they're at this temperature. So take the slab of dough out and place it onto your unfloured counter. And if you want really equally sized hot cross buns, go ahead and get your scale and weigh the whole slab of dough. Then divide that weight in grams by 12, and you know exactly how big each of your 12 buns should be. My calculation came out to about 93 or 94 grams per bun, but I made a last minute decision just to cut these up into relatively equal sized pieces and not worry about how much they weigh. Now here's a really easy way to shape this cold dough into round buns. You're going to need one area of your counter that's got flour on it, and then a clean area as well. Take one of the buns and just roll it in the flour on one side only. So there's a flour side and a sticky side. Fold the corners in, then just place the sticky side against the counter and start rolling. You're making like a claw with your hand. You're putting pressure around the ball as you roll, and that's going to roll, smooth out the edges, and create a nice smooth ball of dough. Let me show you that again. Just dip one side of your roll into the flour, fold in the corner, place the sticky side against the counter, and just roll, 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 roll until you've got a nice smooth ball of dough. Just kind of keep rolling as much as you need to, putting pressure on the ball of dough as much as you need in order to make it into a smooth round shape. Eventually you'll get a shape that looks something like this. The unfloured part of your counter will get sticky from the dough from time to time, but just go ahead and clean it with your bench scraper, and that'll make the rolls a lot easier to shape. Just keep going, shaping using this technique until you've got 12 evenly or relatively evenly sized buns ready to go into your pan to proof. I would suggest using a 9 by 13 inch cake pan, but you could also use just a regular sheet pan for this. And using parchment paper would be best so that nothing sticks to the pan. But I'm going to be using my favorite non-stick focaccia pan because nothing sticks to this thing and I love it. Plus I ran out of parchment paper again. Classic me. Once you've got these buns nicely arranged in rows and columns, it is time to let these babies proof. So cover up the pan with plastic wrap or anything else that will allow the buns not to dry out during their long proof. These will honestly take a long time to double in size, just like it did during the bulk fermentation. They go very slowly. So I would move these to a warm spot in your kitchen again. I'm going into my turned off oven and let them proof for about 6 hours or until roughly doubled in size. 6 hours later, the rolls won't look very puffy, but they are definitely bigger. They're light and delicate to the touch. They bounce back a little bit when I press on them. I can tell they're filling up with air, so these are ready to bake. I set my oven to preheat to 350 degrees Fahrenheit, and while it's preheating, I'm preparing my paste mixture that's going to make the crosses on top of these hot cross buns. This is just equal parts flour and water. I'm using 75 grams of flour and 75 grams of water. Once I've mixed it all, I moved it to this plastic bag, which I'm using as a piping bag. Any kind of plastic sandwich bag should work for this. Get the air out of the bag and twist it up to create pressure inside of the bag so that it's easy to squeeze out the mixture out of the tip. Then cut a very small piece of plastic off the edge or the tip of the plastic bag with the scissors. You're going to be drawing lines across the dough, which will make the cross, and you want the line to be fairly small because it's going to spread out as it sits. So make sure the hole that you cut into the plastic is a little bit smaller than you think you need. And this is the satisfying part of making hot cross buns, I think. Just go across each of the rows of buns, making a line. Then once you've got the buns crisped in one direction, you're going to go the other way on the buns, crossing all of them, and you'll end up with a nice white cross across the top of all of the hot cross buns. Once all of your buns are looking like this and your oven is preheated to 350 degrees Fahrenheit, these are ready to bake. Move the buns to the middle rack of your oven, and then if you want to add some steam to your oven, you can spray the oven with a water bottle or throw a few ice cubes into the bottom of the oven. That'll create some steam in the oven so these buns can rise properly. Bake them for 40 minutes at 350 degrees Fahrenheit until the buns are golden brown like this. Move the hot cross buns to a wire rack, and then if you're not using any parchment paper in your pan, go ahead and loosen up the buns with a spatula just so you make sure they're not sticking to the pan, and remove them onto that wire rack where they can cool. Now you might be saying, these look okay, they look kind of dull though, they don't really look very professional. What are they missing? These buns are missing a glaze. Hot cross buns need a glaze to have that professional touch. You can use a sugar and water glaze to top your buns, but I'm going to use some jam or some jelly. I found some apple cinnamon jelly, but any kind of orange marmalade or apricot jam would be perfect for a glaze on top of your hot cross buns. All you need to do is take a few tablespoons of the jam or jelly that you're using, heat it up in the microwave for about 30 seconds. That'll loosen up the jam and make it a lot easier to spread. Then just take a pastry brush or something like that and brush the jam onto the rolls in a nice even layer. You want to coat all the exterior parts of these hot cross buns with the glaze. That'll give them the nice glossy finishing touch that you're looking for. Now, it's usually recommended to let your bread cool down before you eat it, but I find that these hot cross buns are great when you just let them barely cool down, so they're still warm and a little bit steamy on the inside. It might not be the proper way to eat them, but I think it's really good. These sourdough hot cross buns are sweet, but they're not too sweet, and the spice is perfectly balanced by the juiciness from the raisins. I think they're perfectly spiced. In preparing for this video, I made about 3 batches of these sourdough hot cross buns. I can tell you they're delicious when you enjoy them fresh while they're still warm, and if you let them cool down, they're really good if you heat them up again, or if you cut them in half, toast them, and enjoy them with butter. I think that might actually be my favorite way to have these hot cross buns. However you enjoy them, I do hope you make these this year, and have a happy Easter from Grant Bakes.